All right, I think let's get started. So this is the second in our series of webinars inspired by the book, Digital Technology and Capacity Development, that we at INASP recently um, published through African Minds. And we'll talk a little more about that book during this webinar. So this is a 1-hour session. Just a few points about housekeeping. So we're going to record this webinar. If you face any technical issues, you can contact Caitlin. Or actually, yeah, I think we maybe don't write to that email address. Should have updated that. But hopefully there won't be any technical issues. You can always post on the chat if you have any trouble. After setting the scene, Andy, who is program specialist and authority project manager, will present INASP's findings related to how we've designed online courses in the face of digital infrastructure constraints that are common with the participants that we reach. That'll be followed by a panel discussion. We have 3 panelists here with us today, and we'll wrap up with a question and answer session. You can post your questions on chat through the chat feature anytime during this webinar, or we'll see if we have time to take a few questions, or you can speak your question as well. But otherwise, feel free to use the chat.
Non ho capito, sono entrata ma non ho capito cosa è successo.
I'll be monitoring the chat window, so we'll try to take as many questions as we can. So a warm welcome to our panelists today. We have Professor Dilshani Dissanayake from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we have Kendi Muchungi from the Brain and Mind Institute at the Aga Khan University in Kenya, and Shanali Govender from the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So our panelists will be taking 2 questions that we have prepared about related to this topic of mitigating infrastructure constraints. That'll be a little later. Let me talk a little bit about INASP. INASP is a non-profit and international development organization based in the UK. We've been around for 30 years. Our vision is to put research and knowledge at the heart of development. And we do this by supporting individuals and institutions to produce, share, and use research and knowledge to transform lives. We've been involved in technology-enhanced learning since 2011, close to 12 years now. Our first online course, that was back in 2011. We've trained researchers on how to publish, librarians on aspects such as copyright and licensing. We've also run courses for journal editors. Before 2011, pretty much all of the training was face-to-face, but we saw a growing demand for online learning, and that was actually well before the pandemic, which was 2009, 2020. We started offering massive open online courses back in 2015. So we have MOOCs, which are well-known, research writing MOOCs. We have specialist courses for smaller audiences, self-study tutorials, and so on. When the pandemic hit, we increased our online offerings, and we also conducted a meta-analysis of the data we've collected for over 10 years, and share our findings and lessons learned with other organizations who are just starting to develop more online capacity development approaches. And that's how our book came into being. This is an open access book published a few months back by African Minds. Maybe at this point, I will hand over to Andy Nopes to talk a little more about what we have found course of our work. Andy?
Okay, thank you very much, Ravi. My name is Andy Nobes. I'm one of Ravi's colleagues, and I've worked for many years with Ravi and a team of guest facilitators in running the AuthorAid MOOCs, which will be mentioned a couple of times in this presentation. And I'm going to talk about the findings in our recently published book, particularly around the assumption around technological barriers. So so this is the book that's published at the end of January, and as Ravi says, it's an open access book, so you can download a copy, and also you can request a print if you prefer a hard copy. So if you go to the next slide, please, Ravi. So there's a whole chapter on methodologies in the book, so we won't spend much time going through that, but generally we've conducted a synthesis of data on our technology enhanced learning initiatives collected from 2011 to 2020, and we commissioned an external research consultant to do this analysis. We've got data from learning analytics and participant feedback data. We analysed data for more than 20 online courses and blended learning activities, many of which we ran on multiple occasions during that time period, and we combined data across courses. We included qualitative data from semi-structured interviews with INASP partners, and we interviewed 20 of those partners on their experience of technology-enhanced learning and the impacts of specific initiatives between 2015 and 2020. We also looked at secondary literature produced at our organisation throughout the years. We published around 30 blogs and reports and lots of other internal reports and documentation which were included in the findings. And then finally, we reviewed the academic literature, which talked about either technology enhanced learning exclusively or partially within the context of the Global South. So that's the methodology. What were the results for the broader picture regarding technology enhanced learning in the Global South? On the next slide. So what we found is in part 2 of the book, we talked about this, and we did a summary of literature in the field. So some of the highlights are there's been a dramatic expansion in technology enhanced learning since 2010, which is reflected in lots of publications, and this has been obviously further accelerated by the COVID pandemic. There's a large body of this literature is concentrated on MOOCs, not surprisingly, but much less written up about other approaches. And the discussion focuses on a number of key dimensions and presents online learning actually as a negative alternative to blended and face-to-face learning. And some of the issues that are pointed out here include a lack of accessibility for women, particularly for those living in rural areas and those also of a lower level of educational attainment, poor completion rates overall, particularly in those MOOCs, the pressures of time, whether learning is either synchronous or asynchronous, and a lack of interaction with peers and trainers. Next slide. And so we identified 6 main assumptions that were prevalent in the academic literature around technology enhanced learning in the Global South. It was associated with a lower level of equity in participation and outcomes, that technology is a barrier to online participation, and we will come to that in a moment, that combining online and face-to-face approaches is much more beneficial than training conducted exclusively online, that online learning does not support participants' interactions very well, which has a negative impact on outcomes, that timetabling online learning is challenging, whether synchronous or asynchronous, and that the use of a one-size-fits-all approach to designing technology-enhanced learning is inherently problematic, and it doesn't take account of context. So then we tested these assumptions against our evidence. And we're going to look very briefly at assumption 2, which was technological barriers to online participation are widespread and reduce the efficacy of learning. And here are some of the findings, and I'll focus on a few of these key findings as we go through. So first of all, I mean, our choice of Moodle to run our online courses reflects the popularity of the application around the world, especially in the Global South. And all of our courses are characterized mostly by a text-based yet interactive approach to present the learning activities. Non-completion of courses may largely stem from broader infrastructure issues affecting the internet rather than issues affecting the technology and platforms that we use. And we found that, for example, 91% of participants across these courses reported that navigation through online platform resources and activities was easy. But other findings, such as a survey of non-completers who didn't complete our courses, found that the majority of those respondents cited time management issues and other work and challenges as a central challenge in completing the course, even more so than infrastructure issues. Next slide, please. So what do we think has contributed to these key findings? Well, we know that the Moodle LMS is a good choice, and it comes with lots of content and activity that fits with the low bandwidth approach that we use, and that most course materials are compatible with mobile devices, particularly as there's a Moodle mobile app, and you can download resources. You can do some of the courses offline, and there's lots of text-based alternatives to multimedia. And of course, that most of our participants study or work in higher education settings and have better access to computers, access to smartphones and the internet, and particularly internet data. They perhaps have better English fluency, digital fluency than the average person in any given country. And they may have more prior experience of using a learning management system. Next slide, please. So obviously, as part of our approach to supporting low bandwidth learning, asynchronous online methods are pretty essential to this. And when designing an online course, we think that you should always do so from the standpoint of a learner who has the least reliable access to the internet, who gets online at the lowest speeds, who also has the potentially the lowest level of digital literacy and least experience of online learning. And so one of the models we often refer to is this community of learning model, which is shown here, which covers social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. And these are particularly challenging in asynchronous learning as opposed to synchronous interaction. So for example, so looking at self-study courses versus facilitated courses. When we work with, when our designers design these courses and resources, we work with critical friends to understand the best points to use content smartly and get the learner to reflect using things like online quizzes, examples, reflection points during the course, and links to external resources. So with facilitated courses, there's also obviously a challenge with fostering low bandwidth social interaction. So we then start to look at how do we engage facilitator presence and social presence. And some of the things to think about are things as simple as providing weekly updates, very short introduction videos, particularly engaging discussion forums where we use our team of facilitators to really interact with the participants, peer assessment activities and networking forums. And I've mentioned here 2 of the case studies that are mentioned in the book, which you can check out. Next slide, please. Thinking about these 2 different approaches, I mean, asynchronous learning is already more flexible, as it means you can log on at any time, you can do the learning at any point during the day to balance your other responsibilities. But there's still some key differences between facilitated and non-facilitated courses, and sometimes it may be worth considering the pros and cons of these approaches or balancing these approaches. So we found with self-study courses that we've run, which people can do within their own time, that the completion rates for these courses may be a lot lower than the online courses which are facilitated, particularly the MOOCs. But there's more flexibility in this learning. There are no deadlines. It's better for those with time management and other work challenges, other life challenges. With facilitated courses, there are obviously advantages to having a facilitator team on hand. We're able to send regular emails and reminders. There's interaction between the facilitators and other learners in the forums. You can get clarification on some of your learning and get follow-up answers in the forums and from facilitators. And there's a clear schedule and deadlines, which for many people, they find a motivation to be there at a certain time with other learners and to have certain points they know that they need to complete activities by. And again, we've provided a couple of references to the case studies in the book, which you can check out. And then finally, next slide, I wanted to just mention going forward, we have experienced a changing expectations, particularly during the COVID pandemic. We've actually seen the completion rates of some of our online courses, and particularly the MOOCs, dropping slightly. And this could be due to the increases in time commitments and focus, which were mentioned earlier, but could also represent a change in expectations and styles of online learning and styles of interaction with others. So even though expectations of online learning have always been changing over the last decade, they've particularly accelerated during COVID. And this massive pivot to online has meant that more and more people are experiencing online lectures and videos as the norm in learning. And so they expect online learning to actually mean live sessions, live lectures, lots of links to videos. And now some of our learners who are coming to our courses for the first time are surprised to see such low bandwidth content, such text-based content in the learning materials. And so we've had to rethink our approach and see if we can redesign our course for a variety of different learners with different expectations, as well as considering those with the least internet bandwidth. Finally, one of the things that we've noticed also during the last few years is online discussion forums have seen a drop in interaction in our courses, and this could represent a different expectation of what online discussion means. And instant messaging, such as WhatsApp, is much faster and snappier, and there's a different style to online interaction, which may mean that online forums are an old way of interacting online. Next slide, please. I'll just say one last thing, and that is that we'll be trying out some new ways to address some of these online challenges by piloting some new approaches to really amplifying and increasing participant engagement and facilitator presence on our next online course, which starts in a few weeks, the details of which are on the AuthorAid website. But I'll pass back to Ravi now to talk to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Andy. So in case any of you are wondering how to enroll in this course, if you go to the AuthorAid website, you'll find a link to it. And yeah, Tabitha has posted a message in the chat about the exact link. Okay, so now let's move to the next section of this webinar with our panelists. So we have three panelists here. Thank you so much for joining us, Dilshani, Kendi, and Shanali. We'd like you to hear your thoughts on a couple of questions related to this topic. So I'm gonna read out a question, and maybe yeah, we'll pop it in the chat as well. The first one is, in your context, have the inequities around online learning changed since before the pandemic? And are those changes for better or worse? So maybe let's perhaps start with Dilshani. What are your thoughts, Dilshani?
Thank you, Ravi. I will share my experience and observations as a teacher in higher education and also as a parent. Before the pandemic, I think we had no plans to teach any of our courses fully online. So we didn't have an assessment as to the availability of physical, human, or social resources to go fully online. And then when the pandemic struck, it was a turmoil, and we had to go for fully online teaching learning It was kind of an emergency measure that we took. So initially it was hard because now when it comes to now we're looking at equity. Now, if you look at the medical faculty, we went fully online, and we had a percentage of students who did not have access to internet and also didn't have any equipment. But majority of them had smartphones. But some of the teaching learning activities that we did, they could not access. So we had issues delivering teaching learning activities at the initial stages, but we actually took a lot of steps at the beginning. When it comes to physical resources, we had issues with equity. And then when it came to human resources, also training staff, because we were not trained to do online teaching learning. And we had to get trained very quickly and not in a very convenient or a suitable environment where we had a pandemic going on and the medical staff was involved in that as well. But training and getting human resources, that was also a challenge. But if you compare before pandemic and then after pandemic, because we went through this process of training, trying to get physical resources, changing our mindset to do online teaching learning activities, even at school level, our kids also went fully online and the teachers also tried their best to deliver. I think now we are thinking of doing fully online courses. We are planning postgraduate courses in hybrid mode. But as academics, I think we still believe, now I looked at the assumptions that you have got from your research, we still believe that face-to-face teaching learning is better, or we are always thinking of doing hybrid courses where we have face-to-face sessions as well as online sessions. We haven't moved to fully online mode, but the research course that we developed with you, with OTA, is quite online, and we have only one face-to-face session. So compared to before pandemic, after pandemic, I think we have more physical, human, and social resources for online teaching now.
Okay, thank you, Dilshani. Kendi, what are your thoughts on have the inequities around online learning changed since before the pandemic in your context?
So thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Dilshani, for sharing your perspective. From my perspective, there are still there are pre-existing inequalities that still have not been met, even after the pandemic. So during the pandemic, the key things that stood out was that we sent people home. My university, for instance, was the first university to close down. I was working at African Nazarene at that point, and we were the first to send our students home. But there was no data as to what resources our students had when we were sending students home. And that lack of data was really detrimental in terms of helping the decision-making process as to how to best support students to learn remotely and to learn online, because those are two distinct components where you have students that actually are living in very remote areas. And so some of the key inequities that we saw was that in some areas of our country, there was a significant unreliability of internet connectivity. I think I was writing it down, about 60% of our students did not have the devices so that they could work online. The level of students' aptitude for or digital literacy was actually quite low. The other really interesting thing that we've not considered, and possibly moving into the future would love to consider, are the issues of even content that we provide as additional resources are all in English, and yet some of our languages, some of our countries have other distinct national languages, mine, Kiswahili, and multiple others. The other component was the accessibility of data bundles, because students would have to buy data bundles so as to be able to access the online learning platform, so as to be able to engage. But beyond that, our faculty were also didn't have the capacity to offer transformative learning opportunities online. So you can't do what you were doing in a face-to-face setting, in an online setting, where you just dump. And actually, probably that's a bigger conversation, a wider conversation as to capacity of our faculty in delivering transformative and engaging learning opportunities for students. And possibly one of the most detrimental was the aspect of considering persons with special needs in terms of inclusion. How are we putting our content online? Did we have alt text? Did we have audio components? All the other components that meet persons who have special needs, those who are hard at seeing and those who are hard at hearing, and all those other components that we do take for granted. And so I think the pandemic exacerbated the existing inequities. And unfortunately, I can't say to date that we are addressing all of them, but through a few engagements, I think within us, one of our key projects, the TESEA project and multiple others, these have been the conversations that have been ongoing through entities like the Association for Faculty Enrichment and Learning and Teaching, have engaged with the government to talk about ways with which they could be more intentional about bridging the gap. Having said that, in Kenya, I feel the government did bridge the gap quite a bit in terms of talking to mobile service providers or internet service providers within our country, so as to be able to engage them to reduce their rates for students and faculty. So I think that was pretty amazing. And then initiatives like where people could pay for devices were introduced, so you pay over several months as opposed to putting a single one lump sum payment to get a digital technological device. Yeah, and the government also ring-fenced some amount of money for data to allow for people to buy data bundles. They actually subsidize that for faculty and students, but there's still a long way to go. And it just opened our eyes as to how much further we need to go. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Ravi, sorry.
All right, sorry. Thanks, Kendi, for also sharing the specific examples of how a positive change. Shanali, what are your thoughts on this question? It's in the chat window in case you'd like to refer to it.
Great, thanks so much, Ravi. And thank you to both Kendi and to Dashani before me. I think that listening particularly to Kendi's, it was really clear to me that in the South African context are parallels with the rest of Africa, and certainly with the Kenyan context, are incredibly strong, both in terms of what was done in a kind of short-term window around the pandemic, but also what we've done subsequently. I think what I do want to say, though, is that I speak as somebody who works at the University of Cape Town, and we are a historically advantaged university, and we've got quite a long history of, relatively speaking, in our context, of working on online learning in various ways. So in many ways, I just want to preface this by saying that we were better prepared and better resourced to respond to the particular challenges of the pandemic than many other institutions. So I don't speak for the whole of South Africa here, just for UCT in many ways. But I'll try and make the extensions where I can. So in terms of short-term changes, in terms of the kind of inequities around online learning during the pandemic, there were, as there were in Kenya, lots of short-term stopgap measures that were taken up really strongly. So we also had the zero-rated sites. Devices were made accessible to students on a loan basis during the pandemic. There was a kind of process of taking courses and putting them into online spaces across our institution and across many South African institutions. But it was very much an emergency process. It was an incredibly rushed process. I think in that short-term change, some of the things that really stood out for me, though, as incredible positives in that time was in the UCT context, it became a kind of experimental time. There was this sort of sense that things that one might not want to do under normal circumstances as being too risky, we were able to play with just a little bit during that time. So, for example, the institution trialed for the first time in our recent history, certainly, a pass or fail system. So students either passed or they failed, which had some knock-on effects in subsequent years in terms of student readiness and so on, but also really shone the spotlight on the kind of learning that was happening in classes that was really interesting. The other two things I think that were really important that happened in this space that I think I would view as substantial shifts and improvements was that staff became very vocal on behalf of their students in terms of access and socially just arrangements around learning and teaching. So historically, staff have sometimes found themselves at loggerheads with students in terms of how students and staff see each other and the nature of that relationship. And there was a moment in the pandemic when definitely I heard consistently people saying, is this fair for my students? Are my students going to cope with this? Can my students do this? And doing that openly and publicly and very, sometimes quite high risk for her. And I think that was a really important shift. So for us, there was something about the pandemic that made inequalities that were often quite hidden because our students could come to campus and access the kinds of resources that the institution itself offers. The pandemic itself kind of forced us to see the spotlights or to shine the spotlight on the students' home context, and that was incredibly important. The other thing that I think happened, I found really powerful during the pandemic, was staff stopped thinking only about teaching and learning as it happens within the context of the lecture room. And so I can recall during the pandemic and after constantly having conversations with staff about, well, how do you constitute your classroom? How do you constitute a learning space when that space is so multi-layered? When at the time we were fully in an online space, but since then people have been asking questions about how do I think about what kind of learning my students are doing outside the classroom? Sure, when I've got them there, this is what I see, this is what I can manage, but also how do I support what they're doing outside? So I think for us, the substantive changes really were around thinking about what it is like to teach and live in a digitally enabled but inequitable context. I think that's just become a thread that we've held onto really strongly since then, despite a return to campus, around a widening scope of interest for staff. So instead of just what are my students doing when they're in the lecture, in the venue, what are we giving them in terms of learning outside that? What spaces are we creating on campus? Physical spaces. What kinds of processes and spaces are we creating for engagement beyond? And then also a real interest in the idea of learning design and educational technology as a project. So particularly addressing inequity through making sure there are sufficient people in a variety of roles, that the infrastructure is accessible not only when people are on campus, but off campus. And then I think the thing that's really surfaced in some ways is an interest in cultures, but in terms of cultures of spaces and cultures of learning and teaching. Yeah, and I think I'll stop there for now, if that's okay, Ravi.
Yeah, thank you, Shonali, for I think one of the striking things is for me from what you said was the increased empathy from staff, from faculty to the needs of students as a result of this kind of increased online ways of teaching. Okay, so let's we have another question that we'd like the panelists to share their thoughts on, and that is, what practical steps can we take to overcome technical barriers while ensuring inclusive design of the course or the technology enhanced learning initiative? So practical steps to overcome technical barriers. Maybe you'll try to keep it the responses a little shorter, but maybe it'd be nice. About 2 to 3 minutes per panelist would be good. Maybe this time, we'll start with Kendi.
Sure. Thank you. 1 second. So in my experience, one of the key things I think that I've been considering, and quite a few of the institutions and entities that I engage with consider in terms of overcoming technical barriers while ensuring inclusive design, is actually one of the key things is what Shanali spoke to, is redesigning how learning happens, what learning looks like. One of the, I think the most tragic components facilitated by or exacerbated by the pandemic was how assessments happened. And because our assessments for the longest time, I think in Kenya and in quite a few of the countries, surrounding countries, have been geared towards learning by rote. When we had to transition to a fully online component, then it just propagated that idea. And so one of the key things actually that at the university I was working in at the time that we introduced was we changed what assessments looked like, because it also changed the attitude of the learner. And so designing authentic learning assessments, what does that look like? If you require students to come up with, say, a budget, or to come up with a concept that has implication on the community, then one of the key things that we got them to do was engage a bit better with the community. And their assessments were based off of impact on the community, as opposed to just submitting an assignment that has multiple choice questions or giving an essay response. And evidence like pictures, videos were required so as to give evidence towards something like that. And I think this changed a lot of the thinking and just the redesigning of that. So it meant that we give first how we submitted the assessments was also on WhatsApp, as well as on the platform, so that we have a WhatsApp group. Students are then able to quickly take that. Nobody says they don't have access to WhatsApp, at least not in our region. Most students have access to that, and they would be able then to read the instructions quite easily, and then let us know when they've submitted their work, but we'd also check online. The other key thing, sorry, I wrote some of these down so that I don't forget, was rethink what students had to learn. I think we've always looked at learning as you cover 14 topics and you've learned the content for that subject matter. We did several training engagements with all faculty, where we got them to think about what are the key concepts that students must know, so that they're able to do, so that they become whatever profession they need to become. And that really changed the thinking of our faculty, and it got us to think about, okay, these are the 5 concepts that they must take away, as opposed to thinking, let's cover the entire curriculum. That won't work. The other really amazing bit was we created opportunity for international guest speakers. So it might be counterintuitive in terms of thinking there's inequalities, or not many students have access to internet and stuff like that. But it turned out that more students logged on when we had an expert speaker online, because they knew they had something that they were going to get something beyond the normal. And so creating such spaces, intentional spaces, where they knew they would get information direct from industry, from an international or someone that has significant exposure in the field, actually improved the level of engagement between of students within our sessions. Yeah, and the other thing was also just relooking at the peer interaction, because the most significant thing that was affected was the socialization component of students. And so one of the things that we did was engage a lot more on WhatsApp as opposed to on the online learning platform, and create some kind of a community there so that we could get more students engaged. And actually the input, the feedback, all that was, it came in a lot more via WhatsApp than on the platform. And it just required a little bit more flexibility. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kendi. Yeah, like that, you know, the use of WhatsApp in particular to support, you know, interactions or, you know, in some way. Maybe Shanali, would you like to share your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ravi. So I think I'm going to kind of hold myself to 3 key points. The first one is that it became very clear to us that while the technology is a necessary but insufficient condition for success for our students. So the thing that floated to the surface was the culture of learning and teaching, not only in the institution, but specifically in the home space. And the culture of homes became the most important thing for us to address. We have things that our students would send us, like pictures of their home workspace setup, where, you know, somebody's got a laundry basket and they've popped a cardboard box on it, and that's where their laptop is living. You know, and students writing and saying, look, if I need to get data, I need to walk. It's a 2-hour walk, then I catch a taxi, then I can go into town, then I can get access to data. So the conditions around the technology became really important to us. And so that's something I think that we're taking forward consistently. And what that has kind of centered for us in terms of the educational technology and specifically learning design space is designing for learning and teaching that happens in diverse contexts, and specifically looking for equity, not equivalency. And so not saying, okay, every single student has to do this activity, but rather thinking about how students can demonstrate their learning by selecting from a range of activities that offer some kind of equity, but are not necessarily exactly the same thing. Designing for choice for our students, giving them some sense of being able to choose within courses, within curricula, either contexts or spaces that would really work for them. And then really thinking about what is the kind of learning in our courses that we want our students to do. I was thinking about what Kendi was saying about the kind of culture of exam taking and rote learning in certain spaces. And that is absolutely the case in the South African context for a lot of our students. They come to us very enculturated into a kind of Marx economy space, into a one right answer space. And in a way, what the COVID experience did allowed us to start thinking outside that, because people's home context was suddenly the context they were learning in, as opposed to coming to UCT and sitting in a nice res room and having internet access, etc., etc. And then, unfortunately, fortunately, the other thing we needed to take on board was the idea of an awareness of students' diverse learning needs. So looking at what kinds of resources they had, what kinds of skills they had, and really paying attention to things like compassionate learning design as ways not only of designing curricula, but also technical barriers. and making sure we address that. And I think I will pause there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shonali. Dilshani, would you like to share a couple of points about overcoming technical barriers?
Thanks, Kendi and Shonali, for sharing your experience. I think now to overcome the technical barriers, we did so many things at the beginning during the pandemic. I think some of the things that we did could be relevant if you are developing an online or a hybrid course at the present stage as well, because the country is now had undergone an economic crisis. So what we did at the beginning, we were really concerned about the equity, because for undergraduate students, they did not join for an online course. They joined for an on-site course, and we had to turn it to online. So we had to make sure that all had access to teaching learning activities. So what we did quickly was to assess the physical resources. So we got everybody together. There were groups contacting students and creating this, like as Kendi mentioned, WhatsApp groups. So we ensured that accessibility was there. And then when we started teaching learning, parallelly, the lecturers were also trained. And now that was a hard thing, because we were not very much for online teaching learning, and we had different ideas, attitudes. So we had to get everybody together to ensure that we have to do it. Now there's no other way. So there was a lot of training, and took some time for us to get used to these different platforms also. So once we started at the beginning, we still noticed that around about 10 to 20. Now, for some teaching activities, for some batches, we noticed about 10 students could not attend at the beginning. So we individually contacted them and we provided support. And as Shonali said, now Colombo Medical Faculty is an advantaged faculty where we have access, resources, and funding compared to other faculties. So this is mainly based on experience from the Colombo Medical Faculty. But I know that other faculties also did the same thing and got support from the government. So we provided devices, we provided support, even financial support for students who did not have access, who didn't have devices. So we had a hard time at the beginning probably for a short period to get everybody together. But slowly we had students joining us, but we were always in touch with them. So the main, the technical barrier for the barriers were such as not having a device or not having access, we managed to sort it out. And I think later on, it actually did not appear as a barrier, because all the students managed to, in the medical faculty, managed to join all the teaching learning activities. But I think, rural areas, other faculties, especially school curricula, they had difficulties in getting students to engage in teaching learning activities. So I think we could not go fully online in those aspects. So sometimes they did on-site teaching, also taking all the precautions. So the main methods that we did to overcome technical barriers was to be in touch with all the students, and also to provide support from the institution.
Okay, thank you so much, Dilshani. So that was really good to hear your experiences, Dilshani, Kendi, and Shonali, in playing quite hands-on roles in dealing with the sort of aftermath of the pandemic. And overcoming technical barriers. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So there is a conversation that's going on. I'm trying. I haven't seen any questions as such. We have a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you could read the conversation that over there. And panelists or Andy, if you'd like to share anything about some of these points in the chat, feel free to do that over the next 5 minutes. Let's see. And I enjoyed reading this exchange between Richard and Monty about how the at universities. This I heard of as well. Even back to in-person lecturing, a lot of students prefer to watch recordings in their own time, and how it's led to lower engagement levels. And I also agree with what Monty King has said about that it's about being more intentional about what to do online. I think this is something we have, to some extent, covered in the book, about what works better online and what doesn't. And I guess, yeah. So it's, I think, just putting things online in the pivot, like, yeah, it can even, I guess, lead to, yeah, for students, if they don't see a point coming to the lecture, if they feel they're just going to listen to the lecture, maybe they prefer sitting at home and watching it. Anyway, so those are some of my thoughts. Any other thoughts on comments in the chat?
I have a question, if I can
Okay.
ask, which is actually related to assessment. Because first, we've heard how COVID pandemic had to kind of change the way in which assessment had to happen for the universities. And now there is this whole debate around artificial intelligence, and in particular ChatGPT. And again, universities have to think about how to change the assessments so that it's about, as Kendi also mentioned, about authentic learning, and not just about replicating what I've heard. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about opportunities that ChatGPT might bring, but also some maybe dangers, and how in your universities are you thinking of dealing with it in the next phases of assessment. I've recently attended a conference in the UK, and there's a lot of talk of, in the intermediate going back to maybe Viva, more face-to-face exams even, until new solutions are being sought, and a lot of also talk about, we can't ban it, we just have to embrace it, and into the assessments actually, and see how we can make assessment more relevant for the current age. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, Candy. Yes, I know now the research course that we are running, now initially the assessment was for them the first assignment was to provide a proposal based on a research topic. With the ChatGPT, I think it's very easy for them to, come up with the topic and then do the proposal. So now the technology is there to support, but if it takes over the cognitive skills and all those skills that we expect the student to develop, then I think we'll also have to work around it. So we changed the assignment. We made it in a different way so that we can assess and see whether the skills have been developed. So yes, it's affecting some of our assessments and assignments. Yes, Candy, up to you.
Thanks. So I think this is definitely a very interesting conversation. Right now, I know people like the Khan Academy are actually integrating GPT into their learning spaces, and there's a paper out, I haven't read it yet, or some report out regarding how they're integrating it. I haven't tested it yet, but we've been doing a few experiments as a group of faculty, and we have a single question, and we all enter different, we all sort of use ChatGPT to get the responses. And the truth is, the nuance that you need a level of intelligence in terms of how you phrase the question, the nuances that you give ChatGPT to get meaningful responses that you could use. And in my opinion, I think it would be a strategy to see how can students incorporate it in their learning. what questions can they use, can they ask and look at and find strategies of applying, because I think at the end of the day, learning beyond submission of essays and completing of assessments is what are you learning. And if there's evidence of the learning, then it doesn't matter whether they are using ChatGPT or GPT-4 or whatever it is. I think the idea is how are they leveraging what they've gotten from the internet or from ChatGPT so that they can enhance or apply their learning. And we want learners that are able to transform themselves and their worlds. If they can use ChatGPT to do personal budget so that they are financially viable individuals, great. If they're able to use it so that they can improve themselves, great. But can they use it so that they can have an impact within their communities? And maybe those are the strategies we should be looking at as strategies for engaging artificial intelligence.
All right, thank you, Candy. And maybe we'll take a comment from Shanali, and then we'll wrap up. Shanali?
Thanks, Ravi. Just briefly, what was really interesting was I was in a conversation the other day where the issue of equity and ChatGPT were brought up together, or equity and AI, and the extent to which really productive use of AI is an equity issue as well. Students who can afford to access the full service versions of AI packages have an advantage over students who don't. Students who come to universities digitally literate are often able to make use of AI in a way that furthers their studies productively, whereas other students who are perhaps less digitally literate might find themselves using it in ways that hamper their learning, and have to run into the wall of an assessment problem before they know that they're doing something in unhelpful ways. So I think for me, again, similarly, one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is to what extent are we providing marketplaces for tools? To what extent are we providing data to tools? And how do we work with those in ways that don't further disadvantage particularly marginalized communities in the globalized South? I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Shanali. I think with that, we reached the end of the time we had scheduled for this webinar. I think there are not any pending questions, so I think we can wrap up. Andy, would you like to, do you have anything to share by way of closing remarks?
No, Ravi. Just to say that it's a fantastic discussion, and I really appreciate the inputs of Darshani, Kendi, and Shanali. Some really good insights, some really good practical insights from their contexts. So thanks very much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And the book is open access. You can download it from the publisher website, Africa Minds, or you can find links to it from the INASP website. So thank you so much for joining us. We have another webinar in this series happening in the middle of May, I believe. So hope you'll join us for that one as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.